Greetings, Professor. I am Hunter Bullard. I am doing a recording of myself talking about my presentation for this final project. I am going to be talking mainly about the situation in Indochina at this time, with the inclusion of Japanese forces, and the big part being the United States' involvement with the Vietnam rebellion force that were trying to oust the French political control and Japanese political control with an independence movement. So, in order to understand the situation happening in what would be Indochina, which would be places like Cambodia and of course Vietnam, we have to go back a little bit to before World War II with the situation of French colonial rule, which had been in place for roughly a century or so now. And during that time, they had a puppet emperor who had been in place with in the country of Vietnam at the time. And through this, they were able to export plenty of spices, consumer goods, and labor. Obviously, the situation was quite dire for these people, and they were not treated to the same respect that other French would have treated themselves. So the situation of people very much disliking the French government and French control was already very much in full swing. However, at the time, the French military and French patrols and French government control over the region was very well solidified. Of course, when World War II had struck open and France had capitulated very early on into the war, and even created their pseudo-fascist state themselves, the region had become quite destabilized, and a lot of military support and policing had almost completely evaporated from the region for a while. At this time, also in 1940, the Japanese would come into trying to claim parts of Indochina in order to continue gaining control over trade routes in and out and around China. The French had still a small presence there, but for the most part, there wasn't much of a strong, unified government presence in the region. This would eventually create a bunch of groups of independence seekers in Vietnam, trying to make an independent Vietnamese state. Most notably would be Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh, and these would also be that group would also be the people that would be supported by the United States later on. Now, during the time in 1940, Japan and Japan and France had been basically not necessarily fighting each other, and for the most part they were just leaving each other alone through much of 1940 and 1941, as Japan had been securing its areas of trade ports, and plus at the time most of that region would be controlled by Vichy France, which was a fascist state and therefore pseudo-allies to the Japanese for a small period of time. Now later on, the Vichy France would be taken out by the Allies, and distrust of the French would begin to increase again. But again, things would not be too harsh on them until about 1945. At that time, much of the rest of the Axis forces had been removed from the war, and thus Japan had become increasingly more and more suspicious of the French presence still in Indochina at this time. And at this time, France would begin to want to continue to bring back its colonial influence on the region. So the Japanese brought up this idea to continue to completely take out the French presence in Japan, which would become Operation Miego in March of 1945. During this time, a lot of different intelligence networks between the Allied forces in Vietnam and Indochina had also been removed with the French presence. Eventually, the group that would be the Viet Minh, later be completely led by Ho Chi Minh, where it would get its name. He would start continuing his independence campaign, which him and other people alongside him had been doing since the French weakening of their presence in the region. So at this time, Japan has now more thoroughly started to bring its control into the region. And this region would eventually end up with the United States having support for the Viet Minh presence, or the independent movements that were happening. The Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh were in very much high regard when the OSS, the United States Intelligence Service, would go in and help assist these groups. And it's surprising that there's actually quite favorable reports about Ho Chi Minh and his band. In May of 1945, they would paratroop United States operatives into the region to help bring weapons and supplies and train the Viet Minh forces in their campaign in order to break up supply lines and help fight against Japanese forces in the region, mainly cutting off a lot of railroad tracks that could potentially lead into China, and continue to give the Japanese large trade outlets. Apparently, as we know now, Ho Chi Minh was very much a communist, but he wasn't a communist in the same sense as what would be later the Chinese, and then, of course, Russia. Even though he had been studying and watching the Russian revolutions that happened previously in 1919 and 1920 and 1921. He also had studied in France with the socialist groups there, and had actually learned how to speak French. And even though he had support for, he obviously had communist, ideology. His biggest goal was liberation of Vietnam first. He wanted independence over most other things. And the OSS reports of him and his guerrilla fighters seems to reflect that a lot. A lot of them actually really liked Ho Chi Minh, and they even called him Mr. Hu and Mr. Ho. When they first met him, they would call him by those names. And many of them even sent reports about how he's basically not even communist, or the part of him being communist is not that important right now. What is important is that he wants to be independent and wants to have a free nation of Vietnam, which, to much of U.S. support, that would be very, very nice, very important to them, because again, liberation and independence was big for the United States ideology at the time and before then. So to see them training and fighting for their country was very important to them. Obviously, not everybody was starry-eyed over Ho Chi Minh's group at the time even, But for the most part, the United States continued to support their guerrilla tactics and fighting till the end of the war, when the Japanese forces were removed and Japan left from the region. Even then, we would still continue to give them support, I guess, after the conflict, when France wanted to come back in, now that they were newly reformed, which was hard for the United States to choose a supporting side for a little while there. They would later go to support the French, but they would pull out support very quickly after France lost a lot of battles later in the early 50s. So this dichotomy of them, because they were communists, became the only reason why we end up having problems with Vietnam later on. Isn't necessarily an issue, or wasn't necessarily an issue at the time when they were being helped. Obviously, you could make the argument that it was more of just because Japan was a bigger enemy. We wanted to stop them, and that was probably a big reason. But also, I think the idea of having another group of people, especially in Asia at this time, trying to become independent, I think was very endearing, and many Americans that were involved with it probably seen that as part of it. Even more famously, when Ho Chi Minh would release his speech after defeating the French after the war in an independence movement, he begins his speech in a very same way as our Declaration of Independence, and with OSS members there behind him, keeping watch and applauding him, and even American planes flew over the audience during that day that Ho Chi Minh would deliver his speech of independence. So this part of the war interests me because it shows the relatively small events that are also taking place during the entire grand scheme of the war. It wasn't just these big countries going at it together. There was also smaller factions all trying to interplay and work off of the chaos that was really coming from the Great World War II. Always interesting that how we can make the United States is famous for making a lot of allies and then them becoming enemies much later on, or even earlier on. So that is my report on the situation of what would be the United States involvement in the Cambodia, in Indochina, and eventually in the liberation of Vietnam before the Vietnam War.